Miles from shore, this kayaker couldn't believe what he spotted bobbing in the water. If you've ever visited the Florida Keys, then you know how packed they are with diverse wildlife. From manatees swimming in crystal clear water to alligators sunbathing along the shore. It's hard to be too surprised by anything that might appear. That's exactly what happened to kayak fisherman Steve, though, as he was returning from a day on the water. He spotted a mysterious shape floating near him. With more than 4 miles to go before making it back to shore, Steve decided to investigate. What he found was more bizarre than he ever could have imagined. Steve was an experienced kayak fisherman with his own YouTube channel, living in the Florida Keys, who thought he'd seen everything. He dedicated his time on YouTube to sailing, fishing, and any other outdoor activities he could. Throughout his adventures, Steve had seen so much, he didn't think anything could surprise him. Then the unimaginable happened. He spotted something in the water, something that he never thought he'd see that far from shore. While running his own YouTube channel, Steve was used to filming his adventures on the water. When he set out fishing on that fateful day in 2017, there was nothing special he was trying to capture. When he uploaded his story, it took over the internet and received the attention of millions of viewers around the globe. Steve had captured something incredible. But what had people so interested in this particular adventure? The sun was setting and Steve was heading home from a fishing trip on his kayak when he spotted it. There was a mysterious shape bobbing up and down gently in the water. Steve turned on his helmet camera to record. When he uploaded the video to YouTube, Key West Kayak Fishing, he wrote he spotted a weird-shaped object floating in the distance. Steve knew he had to find out exactly what he'd found. As Steve approached the mystery shape in his kayak, he began to make guesses about what it was. All I could see were the multiple fins running down its back, so I thought it was some kind of palm frond. While a palm frond would have been an interesting find more than 4 miles offshore, what Steve had actually found was not even close to his guess. It was much more breathtaking. The closer Steve got to the mysterious shape, he realized it wasn't a palm frond at all. He had to stop and do a double take to make sure his eyes weren't playing tricks on him. What was he seeing even possible that far offshore? It wasn't a palm, it wasn't even close. For the moment, all Steve knew was that after all these years on the water, the Florida Keys had finally shown him something new. Suddenly, and without any warning, the shape began moving. It was swimming. Was Steve going crazy after spending more than 20 years on the water? Looking back at the shore and thinking about what this creature could be, the answer finally came to him. But how did this animal end up so far away from the shore? Some questions don't have answers, but Steve didn't need one. What he needed was to conduct a rescue mission. To his amazement, Steve had stumbled across an iguana. The reptile could swim, but didn't belong this far from home. Not sure what to do yet, Steve asked, "Dude, what are you doing out here? Are you lost or what?" Of course, Steve knew the iguana couldn't answer him, but he was too bewildered to care. Next, he needed to decide how to help the poor lost creature. What could he possibly do? Find out about Steve's master plan next. With nothing to lose, Steve offered the iguana a lift. "I'll give you a ride back to shore." There was no way he could know if the reptile would take him up on his offer, but he had to try. To the iguana's credit, it seemed to understand that Steve wasn't a threat and began to approach the kayak. The next step was to see if the creature was just curious about the vessel or if it did indeed want to ride. The situation may have appeared funny on the outside looking in. Here was this small animal swimming in the open ocean, approaching a motorized fishing kayak. Could it even figure out a way to get on board? For Steve, this was no laughing matter. He knew the wildlife that lived in the Keys, so he knew there was no way this iguana should be this far from shore. This was a very serious situation. Seeing an iguana swimming so far out in the ocean would have been head-scratching to most people. Steve had his ideas about what happened, though. "I've seen plenty of iguanas swimming around the islands, but never went out that far. Most likely because of the king tides that are occurring, it got caught in one of the swift outgoing tides and got pushed out to sea." And with that knowledge, Steve knew he needed to act fast. If you don't know what a king tide is, it's what happens when major storms flood streets. The water washes away back to the ocean, creating a much higher tide than usual. At the time this iguana was washed out to sea, Florida had just been hit by a storm. When the floodwater rushed through the reptile's habitat, the current would have been too strong for him to swim against. Steve had offered the iguana a ride back to shore. Now it was up to the reptile to accept the offer or not. The fisherman hoped that the animal would, because otherwise it would stand very little chance of survival. He wrote, most likely the iguana would have died out there, as the current that far out would most likely push it east with very little chance of coming back inshore. The iguana swam from the front of the kayak to the back, searching for a place to grab on and climb aboard. When it found a spot, it reached up, but it was too exhausted to successfully grip. Unable to pull itself to safety, Steve needed to give the iguana a helping hand without scaring it off. There was no way to know if the animal trusted Steve or not, so any move he made had to be done with caution. Luckily for Steve, right next to him was his paddle. He reached for it and carefully positioned it in the water under the iguana. Now the reptile had a place to stand while it navigated its way onto the kayak. It was clear the animal was exhausted. Who knows how long it would have lasted floating alone in the open ocean before Steve came along. Standing on the paddle, the iguana took a moment to catch its breath. Stabilized on the paddle, the iguana pulled itself onto the support beam of Steve's kayak. As you can see, it took in its surroundings and tried to find out where the land it came from was supposed to be. Perched on the bar, the iguana looked majestic. This wasn't the end of the rescue, though. Steve had successfully gotten the iguana to safety, and now he needed to get it back home. After a bit, the iguana moved to the cooler on the back of the kayak, ready for the journey home. Steve warned, "All right, get seatbelted in because we're going to go flying." Remember, Steve's kayak was motorized, and he was more than 4 miles from shore. With the sun setting, he wanted to make sure he got the iguana home while it was still light out so he could find out where it came from. Steve turned on his engine, unsure if it would frighten the iguana away. Thankfully, it didn't, and the two were headed back to Florida together. Every now and then, Steve would look back to make sure his new friend was okay. Not only was the iguana okay, it looked like it was genuinely enjoying the ride and watching the sunset. It must have known how lucky it was, and it was now taking in every moment of life it had. Somehow, against all odds, the iguana stayed with Steve all 4 miles back to shore. He was stunned and blown away. How was this even possible? Looking back, Steve recollected, it was pretty cool to see the iguana trust me enough. Sure enough, the reptile trusted Steve more than anyone it had probably ever encountered. As they got closer to shore, the iguana began looking at the mangroves, its long journey finally coming to an end. Zooming through the water, the 4-mile journey back to shore was nearly done. The kayak skirted the mangroves, and the iguana watched intently, looking for a familiar spot to swim back to. Slowly, the iguana moved to the back of the cooler and got ready to take a leap of faith. As soon as it spotted the place, it jumped to freedom. Steve had successfully rescued the animal, but he still felt compelled to make sure it was safe. Before making his own landing back on shore, Steve decided to turn around and make sure the iguana had made it back to land safely. He searched through the mangroves near where it had jumped off the boat. Before long, Steve saw a familiar face stare back at him. The reptile was hanging onto some branches with an iron grip. After the long day it had just been through, it's hard to blame it for clinging on for a little extra safety.